Welcome to episode 40 of the Tax Professionals podcast. In this episode, I share with you the key lessons that I've learned from when I became tax manager to when I became senior manager.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
I got an unexpected Teams call from the partner of my team, Sam, minutes before I was due on a client meeting. She was updating me on a discussion that we had a few months back, where I'd asked if it would be possible to become senior manager by April 2022, and if so, what I would need to do to make it happen. One thing she needed was agreement from the partners, and she brought it up in a partner meeting with them. At this point, my brain started to think the worst, that the partners weren't sure I was ready for senior manager yet, so I immediately prepared myself for what could be bad news. So I was then absolutely elated and genuinely surprised when I was asked if I would like to be senior manager from the next day, the start of December. I don't think I've ever been so excited for a promotion. I just wanted to share the news. I think it was a sheer surprise as I wasn't expecting it until at least April earliest. But I think the leadership decision to do it immediately was absolutely spot on, because in that moment and still now, it made me feel very valued and motivated. Anyway, less about me and more about you. This episode is all about sharing with you the key lessons that I've learned from manager to senior manager so that you can apply them to your own working career. The first key lesson starts at roughly 2 minutes into the episode and is in relation to delegation. The second starts at roughly 10 minutes and is in relation to developing and training staff. The third starts at roughly 18 minutes and is in relation to client relationships. And the fourth, and most important, in my opinion, is at roughly 24 minutes and 15 seconds, and is what I call the one thing approach. You may be interested in my free email course to help you to figure out the direction that you want to take your career in and know what you need to do to get there. It's split down into steps, referred to as days in the course, and there's a single objective behind each day, and guidance and suggested actions to help you to achieve it. You can sign up at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free course. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. So my first big lesson is that delegation is hard. It takes time to learn, but it does have huge payoffs if you do it well. Early on in my career, I remember seeing quite a few people that were senior that seemed to be so busy all the time because they kept all the work to themselves and didn't really delegate. And I used to just think, surely it must be so easy to just ask someone else to do some of these things for you, and it would save you so much time, it would take a lot of pressure off you. But I realised that was quite a naive approach, and I now have a much better understanding of why a lot of people avoid delegation, and that's because delegation is a really hard thing to do well. And in fact, it doesn't always save you time. There usually has to be some form of time investment, I think, before delegation is actually beneficial. But for me, I think it's so worth it. So a few weeks back, maybe even a month back now, I'm lying in bed this one night, completely unable to sleep because I just have 101 thoughts just kind of racing through my mind at once in relation to this one project that I had ongoing at work. There was an imminent client deadline in relation to this project, and we needed to finalise the output to them before a meeting that we had with them in a few days' time. A few weeks back, I'd asked a colleague to do the initial draft of the outcome for this project that we needed to discuss in this meeting. I did that for a few reasons. I thought it would be a really good training experience for this person. It would allow them to work on a bit of a different project to what they'd worked on before. They'd been working on a lot of things that are repetitive, so I just thought it'd be a bit of a change and a good all-round experience for this person. And so I delegated the piece of work to them following my usual delegation approach at that point. That approach was basically to have a discussion with them up front, talk through all the different areas of the project following my delegation form, which basically covers the background to the project, what the outcomes are, what the deadlines are, what the expectations are, any admin that they needed to do, any resources that they had, and so on. And I'll talk about all of this in a separate episode. And after the meeting with my colleague, I completed my delegation form by filling in the information and I sent that over to them. Now, up until that point, I thought that if I were to follow my delegation approach, that they would almost guarantee that the work that would come back to me would be almost client ready. So it would only need like a shortest review, a few tweaks here and there, and it wouldn't take a large amount of time. But on this occasion, it just hadn't worked out that way at all. And I was now under pressure with my buzzy mind, lying in bed, unable to sleep that night. I didn't want this situation to happen again, so I had to think about what I could have done better or even differently in this situation, and in a way that would have, I suppose, mitigated the chances of the outcome not being as close to client ready as what I'd have liked. In a training session a few weeks later, there was some new information that came to light about delegation that I hadn't known about previously. The trainer said there were basically 4 different types of delegation. And I want you to imagine a scale where there's almost like 2 different scales. One is where you can be really unsupportive or be highly supportive at the top of that scale. And the other one is one where you don't provide much direction and one where you provide a lot of direction. So the unsupportive and lack of direction approach would be to just delegate. You kind of let go of the work, they own it, you put a lot of trust in them, they keep you posted, but you're really hands off. You don't really provide a lot of support day to day, and you don't give a lot of direction. The one that's unsupported but with a lot of direction is the instruct. So you kind of give clear goals, clear deadlines, details, expectation, and you pretty much tell them exactly what to do. Now imagine the one where there's not much direction, but there's a lot of support. And this one is coaching. So you kind of ask and guide them through the project or task. So you give them self-direction by asking them particular questions. You help them solve their own problems by asking them questions, and you encourage support and drive. The last one, which is highly supportive with a lot of direction, is engage. So you kind of give them clear goals like you do with instruct. You give them detailed tasks, you explain to them why they're doing it, you answer lots of questions, and you kind of give them a lot of guidance and support around the instructions that you're giving them. So when the trainer was talking about these, I kind of thought, well, I primarily use an engage approach, and I think the reason I'd been doing that is because I found out that approach had worked really well with one colleague, but this other colleague that I was delegating this particular project to was different. Different in that they had different experience, they had different knowledge, they had different strengths, different areas for improvement. So I hadn't really tailored my delegation to the circumstances for delegating this project, and I think that's the reason why it didn't go to plan. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think delegation is always going to be a completely smooth ride, but I do think you can do as much as possible to reduce the chances of it not going to plan. And that's kind of what I learned more in this case, was I need to be more adaptive in my approach so that I can make sure the approach I'm taking is right for the particular project, person, and all the other circumstances that I'd already talked about. I do think that delegation becomes even more important the more senior you become, because you have more responsibility, there's more things that you need to make sure are done, and if you don't delegate, then you can become an exceptionally busy person, like what I saw very early on in my career with quite a few different people. And all I can say really is don't get put off by these bad experiences. This is not the only bad experience that I've had with delegation. It's not gone to plan a lot of times, but I think what has helped me in particular is I'm almost okay with it not going well as long as I learn from it and take something good from it and keep getting better and better over time. It is a hard skill. I now fully accept and realise that it is a hard skill. Now, I'm not naive like I was a few years ago about it, and it does take practice. There's so many different influencing factors. It's such a dynamic thing. So all I can say really is start delegating as much as you can early on in your career, and learn from it each time. So the delegation episode that I mentioned earlier is actually episode 34 of the podcast. I still think there's lots of useful information in that, so I can highly recommend a listen to it. And you can also download my delegation form, which is what I always refer to when I'm delegating, by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/delegation form. My next key lesson is training and developing staff is a long game, but it's so important to do this to kind of have success as a team or an organisation in the long run. So you may work for an organisation where you don't really have any responsibility for the training and developing of staff, but I think for most organisations, particularly where there's smaller tax teams and a smaller organisation overall, you will have a lot of responsibility for making sure that you do this for your staff. And I know this firsthand, that it can be very hard to find the time to do this, because working for an accountancy practice, the most pressing things are doing the client work that you've got and also bringing in new client work. The problem is though, is you can then end up getting so much client work and the team that you have isn't trained or skilled enough to deliver that work effectively. And so you can't neglect training and developing staff completely. So I've got one particular colleague that I've invested a lot of time in to help train and develop over around 2 years, but it's only over the past few months where I'm starting to see a big payoff for this, because it's not something immediate, it's not urgent. People do not learn things and get better overnight. So you've got to be patient, you've got to give the time, and you've got to keep persisting with it and do it regularly. So earlier on in the year, actually, I was driving along some country roads with an ex-colleague of mine on the way to a stag do for another ex-colleague of mine. We still all kind of keep in touch. And the person who I was driving to the stag do is naturally much better at people management than me. I always have good intention with trying to help people to get better and improve, but I also have high expectation, and sometimes that kind of gets in the way, I think, of me helping staff to develop and improve. So I explained a problem that I was having to him, in particular in relation to one colleague, and I kind of was telling him what I'd done so far, and the main bulk of it at that point was I'd given a lot of feedback, but this was primarily in writing, and I was pretty much bombarding the person with written feedback. There's probably too much there and they weren't really interested in it, but it wasn't really working at that point. But my ex-colleague, he made a really good point to me actually that I thought was spot on. He said that maybe I wasn't giving this person enough times on projects to allow them to do a really good job on that project and to develop, so that they could be feeling rushed, and that therefore they're kind of doing the that or do approach, which doesn't really work when you're working in tax, because we need to be 100% right all the time. And so then my mind kind of cast back a bit to think about the situation and what I'd done in relation to this colleague in particular. And he was completely right, because I was saying things like, this task should take only about X amount of time, or don't spend any longer than 30 minutes doing research for this project. So I was restricting them straight away, and looking back at it, although what I was trying to do there was give them an indication of how long it should take to do something, I was also kind of restricting the amount of time that they felt they could spend on that, and so they were probably rushing a bit in that project. The thing is, this person as well that I'm talking about in particular had a lot of client work and a lot of deadlines going on at once, so they probably felt a bit overloaded in terms of work, and they were kind of applying the approach of let's get as much out as possible rather than less of a higher quality. And since I stopped doing this in terms of putting the time restrictions on it and setting loads of deadlines to do things, kind of freeing them up to have the time to do a proper job on projects, spend the required amount of time to do it properly and well, there was a huge improvement straight away. So kind of since then, I've always been really cautious when I'm putting time restrictions and deadlines on people, because I do want to give them enough time to do a proper job. I would always personally prefer member of staff to do less things but do them to a really good quality most of the time. There's always exceptions to stuff like this, but most of the time I'd rather someone spends more time doing something and do the one thing well than, say, 2 or 3 things not well, because if they do 2 or 3 things not well, it's just going to take ages to correct it anyway, so you almost kind of lose the benefit of allowing them to do it. Whereas if they do one thing really well, then you don't have to spend as much time correcting it, and probably you could do the other 2 things that you asked them to do anyway in the same amount of time. So definitely the approach of giving the person the time, to me, I think is the best way to do it. My ex-colleague actually, on this car journey when we were driving out to the stag do, he did make another good point to me that day actually. You might have heard that I mentioned before that I was basically providing pretty much written feedback only. He said that I should provide debriefs after they've done a piece of work to kind of, I suppose, run through the goods, the areas for improvement, and just kind of have a conversation all around where feedback can be provided. I think what was good about that is before I was given lots of written feedback, probably so much that the person wasn't even reading it or wasn't able to take it all on board. Whereas when I do it as kind of a live debrief where we're actually talking back and forth, it gives the opportunity for someone to ask questions and to, I suppose, understand where they were coming from, the approach they took. I just think it helps to give better feedback overall than does if you just provide solely written feedback. Then, of course, you can follow up with written feedback if you want to, and I tend to do that now, but just with 1 or 2 important feedback points, like the most important things to work on next time, rather than giving loads at once. Because if there's too much, then you can't remember what the feedback was, and then you just don't end up applying any of it, which I think was part of the problem before. So these are kind of the best ways that I've found to help best train and develop staff. So I think you've got to give them opportunities to work on lots of different projects and a variety of work so that they can train a bunch of different skills. I think you've got to invest the time into someone to properly delegate work when you're sending them things, and also spend the time to then have debriefs and give them feedback afterwards. I think you've got to be on hand to be able to support them if they need help. If they've got a query when they're doing the work, can they get a hold of you? Can they ask you a question? Can you answer it for them? Sometimes just being on hand to provide support when they need it can be a really reassuring thing. When it comes to providing the feedback and debriefing on a piece of work that's being done, I think you've got to be really careful how much constructive feedback you give compared to positive, because I think there is a fine line. There is one colleague actually where I had basically bombarded them with constructive feedback on 2 projects that are really close to each other, and I think that impacted their confidence and morale and got them quite down, and that was not my intention. My intention was to help them, but it just goes to show there is a fine line, and you're never going to get it right all the time. You just got to be wary that too much feedback that's constructive can be just as bad as having no feedback at all. My next key lesson is investing in client relationships is always going to be a positive thing, whether it's from a business development perspective, whether it's from being able to manage their expectations, or whether it's just being able to give them better advice because you've got a better relationship with them. Investing in client relationships is always going to be positive. Whilst I'm kind of focusing on client relationships here, I still equally think investing in any relationship, whether it's with your internal staff, stakeholders, colleagues, whatever it is, then that's always time well spent. But I'm taking a focus a bit more on the client relationships side of it here, just because I think when you're working for an accountancy practice and you want to kind of progress past manager level, then it's going to be something that you need to spend time doing. I'm speaking to a client over Teams, and pretty much straight away from the start of this conversation, I can just see a huge difference in the way that we are speaking compared to when we spoke the first few times. The client has a very old school type approach, I would say, to working with external advisors, very professional, very polite. But this conversation was just a bit different, and it was great to see. Before diving into the business purpose behind the meeting, we had a bit of a chat about Christmas and other things outside of work. And prior to this, really, that was exceptionally minimal. Every time I'd asked anything to do with something outside of work, I got very little back. It's a bit like drawing blood from a stone, so I didn't really go there. I just kind of moved straight onto the business side of it. But every time I did try and kind of find out a bit more about them. And there was a huge difference in the way we were speaking, because there had been an evolution, I would say, in our relationship. We'd spoken quite a lot over the past few months in relation to a project that we'd been helping them with, and in relation to having catch-up calls after that. And I point this out because our relationship now at this point, I would say, is probably well established. And if you want to be able to help your clients properly, then I think this is absolutely key. Because once you have a good relationship with them, they are more open to sharing useful information with you. You'll be able to understand where they need help, spot areas where you can add value, and then you can package up a service to help them do exactly that. And because you have that relationship with them, they're more likely to say yes, and they're more likely to want to work with you in the future. They're more likely to speak to you, reply to your emails, reply to your calls, because they have that personal relationship with you. People like to work with other people they like and trust and have relationships with. I don't really like the phrase winning work, because I think that sounds quite salesy, but I can't really think of a better way to put it. And investing in client relationships is such an excellent way to win work. And that's exactly what had happened here. So how did I get to this point with this client? So on the first big project that we did for this client, I spent a lot of time talking to them and having emails with them, updating them, which is always something I do anyway, because I think that's part of providing a good service. But I would say I went a little bit further to spend more time speaking to the clients and getting to know them and their business. And not long after the project, I got in touch to basically organise a catch-up meeting to see how they're getting on. So even though the project had finished, I got in contact with them and just had kind of a free catch-up chat. Whilst I was on the phone with them, I scheduled the next call. So before we'd even finished speaking, we already had something in the diary to talk again. And I kept doing that again and again. And that was such a useful thing to do. Martin Sloman actually gave me that little tip about scheduling the next time to speak to someone when you're actually speaking to them, because it increases the chance of you getting something in the calendar with them, and also increases the chance of them actually turning up to that than if you were just to try and call them out of the blue or send them emails or something similar to try and organise something. So I can highly recommend doing that. And the thing is, in this case, actually, because I'd spent so much time talking to them and getting to know them as part of this particular client project, then not long afterwards, I think it was actually part of the catch-up meeting immediately after the project, they asked us to support with something else, and there's lots of other opportunities that we can help them with to de-risk them in relation to many employment tax areas, as well as opportunities actually to save them quite a bit of money. So I intend to keep doing this with the contacts, and whilst I think our relationship is now well established, it could still improve. So I'm going to keep doing that and keep improving the relationship. And you can pretty much do the same approach with any client. You can also do it with internal staff as well. Spend time speaking to them, listening, understanding their problems, giving them little pieces of advice and little things that are helpful to them. Ask searching questions. And if you do all of these things, I think it helps you to build good relationships with people. That's certainly what I think I've learned in the last kind of 12 to 14 months, is doing those things will really help to build a relationship, and relationships are super important. So the episode where I speak to Martin Sloman, the non-pushy sales coach, is actually back at episode 11 of the podcast, so quite early on, and it's to do with converting and winning tax work without being pushy. So if you're interested in listening to that, there will be a link in the show notes of this episode, or you can head on over to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP11. The last key lesson that I want to leave you with this episode is probably the most impactful thing that I've learned in my time from being manager to becoming senior manager, and that's adopt what I'm going to call the one thing approach. There's 2 really great books that I've read where they have kind of touched upon a similar thing. So the one book is called The One Thing, and the other book is called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Both of these books advocate spending time on things that are important to do, that will yield you with big results but are not urgent. And the One Thing book in particular talks about spending time thinking about what these most important tasks are that are going to yield you with big results, and make sure that you schedule out time in your calendar to do these tasks. It's so easy to get distracted and to just deal with the things that are like immediately on your doorstep. Like if someone calls you, it's easy to answer the phone. If someone sends you an email, it's easy to send a response to them immediately. But then you're just being distracted all the time, and you're not spending time on things that are necessarily the most important. You're just spending time on things that are urgent. So I kind of adopted the principles that both of these books teach, particularly in the last 6 months, to come up with kind of the process that I use now. So I set myself kind of almost an overriding target or goal. So the first one of these that I set myself was to become senior manager by April. And now I've set myself a objective of becoming director by April 2023, working a max of 40 hours a week. So that's kind of the target the target and goal that I want to work towards. You might be thinking, I'm absolutely mad by trying to do things in such short timescales, but that is one thing that the book talks about, is set yourself big goals and then take little steps to get there each week, each day, each month, so on. So on the first Friday of a month, I set my objective for the whole month, and every single week I set myself weekly objectives as well to make sure I'm on track. So just as an example, one of my monthly goals, objectives, whatever you want to call it, when my target was to become senior manager by April by working a max of 40 hours a week, was to adopt a team process of scheduling client work, so that as a team we didn't have too much work to do within a single week, and therefore it reduced the chance of having to work lots of extra hours. And then once I'd set that up, my monthly goal was to make sure that the process was actually being followed. So then within each week I would spend time working on the process, and I would schedule time in my calendar that I made sure that I used to do exactly that piece of work. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer in terms of figuring out what your most important monthly goals are so that you can meet your overarching goal, and what your most important weekly goals are to achieve your monthly goals. I would say the hardest part actually is just making sure that you do actually commit to a certain time to work on these things, and then to actually follow through and do it. And as long as you can get into a habit of scheduling time out in your calendar to do these things, and then also making sure that you follow the block of time in your calendar to spend on doing that task, as long as you can do that and come up with sensible goals and objectives, then I think that's all you need to do in this regard. You might be highly skeptical that this is actually going to yield any form of result, and I can say that I actually felt a little bit the same too, but I also thought at the same time, what's the harm in giving it a go? And I think actually this is one of the biggest contributors to becoming senior manager after 14 months of being manager. And I was actually speaking to someone today actually who told me that most people are manager for around 2 years before becoming senior manager. I actually didn't know that, but I think what's made it possible for me is spending that time thinking about what are the most important things I need to do to reach that goal, and then actually doing it. So this process of sitting down each week and month and thinking about what my monthly and weekly goals are really the main way that I've been able to put time aside to be able to spend it on delegating work properly and trying to get better at delegating, spending time giving feedback and training and helping staff to develop, and also putting the time aside to spend on client relationships as well. So this is why I think this key lesson is the most important one, because without it, I don't think I'd have been able to spend time doing the other important things that I've talked about in this episode. In summary then, these are the key lessons that I've mentioned in this episode that I've learned from the time I became manager to senior manager. The first one is that delegation is hard. It takes time to learn and get good at, but if you can do that, it will have huge payoffs. So do spend time working on that. It's important to dedicate time to training and developing staff. People are the most important thing, I think, when it comes to working in tax. So if you can help your team and organisation to get better, then that's always a good thing all round. And I think it's super important to spend time investing in client relationships for many reasons, particularly if you're working for a accountancy firm. It's good from a business development perspective. It's also good for being able to get them to trust you and open up to you so that you can provide them with the best advice. And my last key lesson, and the one that I think is actually the most important, is apply the one thing approach, as I'm calling it. So figure out what your overarching goal is, and then figure out what you need to do each week or month so that you are on track for reaching that goal. All the episodes, links and books mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP40. The show notes includes a link to my free email course also to help you figure out the direction that you want to take your career in and to help you figure out what you need to do to get there. Alternatively, you can go to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free course. To not miss out on any future episodes of the podcast, get an email notification of each new episode by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The emails will give you a brief summary of each episode, which are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.